Hello friends, welcome to another video where I talk about what I learned in my psychology class this week. We spent a lot of time this week learning about the anatomy of the brain. We used our brains to learn about the brain. It's going to get a little bit metaphysical today. Do you think you can handle it? Take a moment. Brace yourself. This is Introductory Psychology. We're going to start by talking about the three different major divisions of the brain. And keep in mind, throughout this video today, we're going to be talking about different structures, different functions of things in the brain, but it's not going to be a complete analysis of, all the anatomy of the brain. There are many structures and functions that we didn't quite cover, so we're just going to be going over a few of them. Without further ado, let's look at the three major divisions of the brain. We got the hindbrain, the forebrain, and the midbrain. And so I think what we should do now is just pick one of these and take a deeper dive and learn more about it. Let's start at the top with the hindbrain. Let's talk about some of the structures in the hindbrain. There could be more, but all we talked about in class was these three here, so that's what I'm going to focus on today. And we can start with the medulla. The medulla is located in the back of the brain, right on the spinal cord, and it controls a lot of survival functions such as respiration, your heart rate, blood pressure, things of this nature. These are what's known as autonomic processes, and the medulla is in charge of quite a bit of them. Up next we have the pons. This is a small bulge that's located directly in front of the medulla, and it is responsible for the regulation of things like movement. It helps us sleep, it helps regulate sexual arousal, as well as respiration. Last but not least, we have the cerebellum. This is commonly known within the scientific community as the testicles of the brain. There are two small hemispheres located in the very back of the brain, and they're responsible for muscle coordination and balance. And how the cerebellum works is the idea or command to get up and walk around, or me making these little arm movements and stuff when I talk. The idea for those originates in a place like the forebrain, which we'll talk about next, but then that information gets sent to the cerebellum, who processes it and allows me to engage in those movements. Well, the hindbrain seemed easy enough, just three things that we learned about. Let's take on a bigger challenge and learn about the next major division of the brain, the forebrain. And here's where things get a little bit tricky, because within this major division, there are two distinct major structures that make up the forebrain. There's the cerebral cortex and the subcortical structures. So we'll take a deeper dive into each one of these, learn about them, what they're composed of, what they do, and then we'll zoom back out and look at the next major division, the midbrain. But for now, let's learn all about the cerebral cortex. When we think of a brain, we typically think of that wrinkled, mushy mass. That's the image that usually comes to mind, for me anyways. And that is actually exactly what the cerebral cortex is. Now, the cerebral cortex is a pretty big part of the brain, and so while it's part of the forebrain, it is further divided into four different lobes, the lobes of the cerebral cortex. And we'll talk a couple minutes about each of these and what they do as well. And we can go ahead and start with the frontal lobe. As you may have guessed, the frontal lobe is located in the front of the brain. And this is typically associated with our higher thinking processes, rational thought, social processes. It helps us focus our attention on things and plays a really critical role in curbing our impulses. It helps keep us under control. Up next, we have the occipital lobe. This is located in the back of the cerebral cortex and quite simply is associated with processing visual information. Up next we have the parietal lobe. This is located in between the frontal lobe in the front and the occipital lobe in the back. The parietal lobe is commonly associated with our sense of touch and for picturing the layout and spaces of the environments around us. Last but not least is the temporal lobe. This is located underneath the parietal lobe and is commonly associated with the perception of facts and objects that are presented to us from the outside world, outside of our brains, outside of our heads, and helps process auditory information. As a result, the temporal lobe plays a critical role in our language function, both in understanding language and communicating through language. Now there's two pretty big problems with our language functions that we learned about when we were discussing the temporal lobe, and they're what's known as Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia. Aphasia is the inability to understand or produce language. So if you have some damage done to your temporal lobe through some kind of head injury, if you have damage to the Broca's area of the temporal lobe, you'll have a hard time producing language and communicating your thoughts. This is what's known as Broca's aphasia. And if you have damage in the temporal lobe in the Wernicke's area of the lobe, you'll have a problem understanding and comprehending language. Okay, now that we learned a little bit about the cerebral cortex, we can go ahead and take a look at the second major division of the forebrain, what's known as the subcortical structures. Now there are a whole bunch of subcortical structures. In class we just talked about these four that I have listed out here: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. And we can go ahead and start by learning, what does the thalamus do? Well, the thalamus helps with sleep and attention, but perhaps most importantly, it is a sort of gateway for all incoming sensory information from the outside world. Sensory information comes in, it goes to the thalamus, and the thalamus sends it out to different parts of the brain to then process that information. For example, if we're looking at something, if you're looking at this video of me talking right now, the picture of me and this whiteboard will go to the thalamus. The thalamus will send it to the occipital lobe that we just talked about, and the occipital lobe will go ahead and process that visual information. It's the great connector and gets information where it needs to go. Up next is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus helps regulate a lot of bodily functions like falling asleep, waking up, and regulating body temperatures. The hypothalamus also helps us experience thirst, hunger, and our sexual desires. But what's really cool about the brain and how, just to give you an idea of how all this stuff works together, is while the hypothalamus will give us the feeling of thirst or the feeling of hunger, the actual command to then get up and go get a drink of water or go get some food comes from the frontal lobe that we talked about earlier, the kind of command center for higher thinking. But the hypothalamus kind of works in tandem with that lobe to make sure that we get our food or water. Up next we have the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a very complex subcortical structure, but because this is introductory psychology, we just learned today that the hippocampus, its main role is associated with memory formation and storage. Last but not least is the amygdala. The amygdala is all about emotion. It helps us process emotional information as well as associate stimuli from the outside world with our emotional responses. And the amygdala is believed to be where fear and aggression originate from. Well, now that we've covered the forebrain and the cerebral cortex and the lobes and those subcortical structures we just discussed, we can move on to the last of the three major divisions of the brain, which is known as the midbrain. Now, we didn't talk a whole lot about the midbrain because it's commonly associated with just movement and regulation of things like body temperature, so it doesn't relate to psychology too much as I understand it. But just to give you an idea of where it's located, think of the hindbrain, which is kind of in the back around the brainstem. The midbrain is just above that, right above the medulla and the pons. That's really all we learned about it. Not a whole lot to worry about here.